This is the third video in my series on the evolution of the Spanish language from its Latin origins. In this video, we'll discuss the fall of the Roman Empire, the rule of the Visigoths, the rule of the Arabic-speaking Andalusian Muslims, and the impact of these historical events on the development of the Spanish language. The fall of the Roman Empire. Beginning in the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire started to disintegrate. A series of administrative measures taken by the Roman government gutted the empire's agricultural middle class. Mandatory military service forced farmers to leave their lands, sometimes for years at a time, and high taxes were imposed to finance the maintenance of huge armies throughout the provinces. As a consequence, many Roman citizens were compelled to sell or simply turn over their land to a small group of wealthy families. These elite families often used slaves from conquered territories to farm the land, rather than providing employment to their fellow citizens. A culture of corruption took root within the Roman bureaucracy, one of the consequences being the theft and embezzlement of public funds. And if that weren't enough, the Romans failed to establish a proper mechanism for the succession of emperors, resulting in a series of civil wars. The Roman military eventually assumed control of the government, leading to the neglect of public order and welfare. Weakened by these internal problems, the Roman Empire became susceptible to external enemies, most importantly, increasingly aggressive Germanic tribes who were making incursions into Roman territory in Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, Italy, and the Balkan Peninsula. Rome attempted to deal with this threat by recruiting Germanic warriors and paying them to fight as mercenaries. However, this strategy proved to be counterproductive, as it diminished the military's allegiance to Rome. The empire became so weak that Germanic tribes managed to invade and sack the city of Rome itself, the Visigoths in 410 AD and the Vandals in 455 AD. The event that's considered to mark the end of the ancient Roman Empire was the deposition of Emperor Augustulus in 476 AD. Visigoths. In the early 5th century AD, Germanic invaders crossed the Pyrenees, penetrated Roman defenses, and began occupying land with the intent to form their own kingdoms in Iberia. Unable to deal with the invaders, Roman authorities enlisted the help of the Visigoths, their former adversaries, promising them lands in southern Gaul. The Visigoths successfully expelled the other Germanic tribes and established a kingdom in their new territory. However, within about 90 years they were driven out of Gaul by the Franks, another confederation of Germanic tribes. Fleeing to the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigoths established settlements in Barcelona and then Toledo, where they managed to neutralize their political rivals and consolidate power, eventually forming the Visigothic kingdom, which spanned much of the peninsula and parts of southern Gaul. Now, the Visigoths were small in number by comparison with the local population of Roman Iberians. The Visigoths didn't want to kill or displace the local people, but established themselves as rulers over them, taking over the governments and administration of an already functioning society. And in this they succeeded. But despite their political dominance, the Visigoths had little influence on the region's predominantly Roman culture. Apart from their small numbers, the Visigoths were partly Romanized. Remember, they'd spent decades in the service of the Romans and then the better part of a century in Gaul. They'd learned to speak the Roman language, adopted Roman legal and administrative practices, and begun imitating Roman art, architecture, and even clothing styles and dining and leisure activities. Initially, as rulers of Iberia, the Visigoths did maintain a distinct identity from the Hispano-Roman population. They were Arian Christians, while the Roman Iberians were predominantly Catholic, and the Visigothic elite maintained their own legal system based on Germanic customary law, while they ruled over the Iberian population according to Roman law. However, beginning in the late 6th century, Visigothic kings took significant steps to promote unity, including converting to Catholicism and establishing a unifying legal framework. Linguistic changes during the Visigothic period. The decline of the Western Roman Empire precipitated the fragmentation of the Latin-speaking world and gave rise to several Germanic kingdoms, including the Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the Visigoths in Iberia. This fragmentation sped up the process of linguistic differentiation between regions, as interactions among speakers of various Latin dialects dwindled. Despite these shifts, it's widely acknowledged that the Visigoths exerted little direct influence on the Latin language as it was spoken in Iberia. The Visigoths were bilingual, speaking Latin alongside their Eastern Germanic vernacular. and the Visigothic language is estimated to have survived until the 7th century, so there was some opportunity for linguistic borrowing. However, the prevailing culture in Spain remained Roman, and Latin was the dominant language. A new noun declension type arose that was applied mostly to personal names of Germanic origin, but was occasionally applied to common nouns. In one instance, Spanish shows descendants of both forms of this paradigm. And a new suffix was introduced for deriving adjectives from nouns. This suffix was never particularly widely used, and is only found in a few surviving Spanish words that aren't terribly common. I've never seen a list of Spanish vocabulary words believed to be of Visigothic origin that was longer than about 10 items. By far the most common is the word ropa, meaning clothing. Here are some others you may recognize. There's just a handful of Spanish place names believed to come from Visigothic. These two obviously contain godo, the Spanish word for Goth. I couldn't find information on the etiology of the other two, but they look like they might also derive from the same source. Some common personal names of Visigothic origin include Fernando, Ramiro, Alfonso, and Elvira. During the Visigothic period in Iberia, there was widespread adoption of a patronymic system of surnames. In this system, the surname was derived by adding this Latin genitive suffix to one's father's name. Over time, this suffix underwent sound changes, converting it into EZ or ES. Other surviving examples of these surnames include Rodriguez, Álvarez, Enriquez, and Ramírez. It may be that the Visigoths favored this type of surname because it was the Latinized equivalent of ancient traditions of patronymic naming in Germanic culture. Muslim invasion. The Visigothic kingdom came to an abrupt end at the beginning of the 8th century when an army of Arabic-speaking Muslims under the Umayyad Caliphate crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and invaded the peninsula from the south. Suffering from a leadership crisis and mired in political fragmentation, the Hispano-Gothic kingdom struggled to mount a coordinated defense against the invading forces. The Muslim armies, who were well organized, experienced, and disciplined with advanced military tactics and technology, encountered comparatively weak resistance and managed to conquer almost the entire Iberian Peninsula in just 7 years. The Muslims advanced into European territory as far as Tours in France, but there they suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Franks in 732. With their aspirations of Islamizing all of Europe halted, the Muslim forces retreated to Iberia, where they established themselves as rulers over much of the peninsula. In the beginning, Muslim rule shared some similarities with Visigothic rule. The Muslims took the role of a ruling class that didn't seek to kill or drive out the local population, but aimed to govern them. However, their rule was also marked by distinct differences. The Andalusian Muslims had their own unique culture, language, and religion, and they were committed to preserving their Arabic Islamic identity. Additionally, in the beginning, most of the Muslim population consisted of military personnel, but over time, large numbers of settlers, workers, and scholars from other parts of the Islamic world migrated to Al-Andalus. This influx transformed the makeup of Iberian society and significantly altered the region's culture. The Reconquest. The Muslims conquered nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula, but a few Visigothic court members found refuge in Asturias beyond the Cantabrian mountains. From this stronghold they launched a defensive campaign against the Muslim invaders, which gradually transformed into a methodical reconquest of their lost territories. Over the centuries, the northern Christian kingdoms progressively pushed the Muslims further south. The 11th and 12th centuries witnessed significant advancements for the Christian forces, marked by key victories and territorial expansions, including the recapture of Toledo, Zaragoza, and Lisbon. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, these Christian kingdoms continued their southward expansion, seizing lands from increasingly weakened and fragmented Muslim principalities, including Córdoba, Valencia, and Seville. The final phase of the Reconquest culminated in the 15th century when the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, united their realms through marriage and focused on the last Muslim bastion, the Kingdom of Granada. After a 10-year campaign, the Catholic monarchs captured the last Muslim stronghold in 1492, effectively completing the Reconquest. With Granada's fall, the entire Iberian Peninsula came under Christian rule, signifying the end of almost 8 centuries of Muslim presence in the region. Al-Andalus and the Reconquest were deeply interconnected historically. The shape of Al-Andalus at any point in time was defined by the frontier of the Reconquest. Of course, it's important to understand that the two sides were not engaged in continual warfare. This period of Spanish history lasted for nearly 800 years. That's a long time to be at war, and understandably there were also periods of peace, sometimes lasting decades. During peaceful periods, the two sides established diplomatic relations, engaged in trade, and exchanged knowledge in fields such as science, medicine, and philosophy. The immense influence of the era of Al-Andalus and the Reconquest on the development of Spain's distinct culture cannot be emphasized enough. There are libraries of books written about this history. It's impossible to do it justice in this brief overview, and interested readers are encouraged to explore it further through their own research. It might seem that the 8 centuries of Muslim occupation of the Iberian Peninsula was more than enough time for Arabic to completely replace Romance, or at least lead to the emergence of some kind of blended language. So why isn't the modern Spanish language an Arabic Romance Creole? The big reason is that Spanish doesn't descend from a Romance language spoken in Arabic Al-Andalus. I'll go into this in more detail in a future video where I describe the emergence and evolution of Castilian. But for now, it's enough to say that the ancestor of the Spanish language arose on the Christian side of the Christian-Muslim divide, and increased in prominence as the Reconquest advanced and the Christian territories expanded. Interestingly, there were Romance dialects spoken in Al-Andalus that were heavily influenced by Arabic. We collectively refer to these dialects as Mozarabic, a term also used to refer to Christian people who lived in Al-Andalus. Mozarabic dialects were not exactly Arabic Creoles. They were Romance languages at their core, but they were heavily influenced by Arabic in vocabulary, syntax, and phonology. Our principal source of knowledge about the Mozarabic language is texts written in Al-Jamiado, a version of Arabic script used for writing in Romance languages. There aren't a lot of surviving Mozarabic texts, but there are some, and they offer a glimpse into the distinctive features of the unique Mozarabic language. Now, Mozarabic gradually declined as the Reconquest progressed. On one hand, people living in reconquered lands came under the influence of the conquerors and their Romance languages. On the other hand, in the progressively shrinking Muslim lands, Arabic became increasingly dominant. By the end of the 15th century, following the fall of the last Muslim stronghold in Granada, Mozarabic was likely no longer spoken by any significant number of people. Some linguists and historians have suggested that traces of Mozarabic may have persisted in isolated rural areas of southern Spain into the 16th or even 17th century, but it's generally accepted that the language was functionally extinct by the end of the 15th century. Influence of Al-Andalus and Arabic on the Spanish language. Although Castilian was not spoken in Arabic Al-Andalus, there was plenty of opportunity for Arabic to influence the growing and evolving Castilian language. There were several avenues of transmission of Arabic into Castilian. Mozarabic. As Christians retook territory, Mozarabic speakers were assimilated into the growing Christian kingdoms. Since Mozarabic was heavily influenced by Arabic, it acted as a bridge for transferring Arabic vocabulary into the languages of the north. Periods of peace. As mentioned earlier, Christians and Muslims were not engaged in continual warfare. There were sometimes periods lasting decades during which the two sides interacted peacefully, so Castilian speakers had direct contact with Arabic speakers. Administration and scholarship. Arabic was the primary language of administration, scholarship, and literature in Al-Andalus. As Christian kingdoms reconquered Muslim territories, they often retained the existing administrative structures and bureaucracies. Additionally, Christian scholars studied and translated Arabic texts on science, medicine, philosophy, and other subjects. This intellectual exchange contributed to the incorporation of Arabic terminology into Castilian. Agriculture, crafts, and trade. Arabic-speaking Muslims in Al-Andalus introduced new agricultural techniques, crafts, and trade practices. As these innovations spread across the Iberian Peninsula, Castilian speakers adopted Arabic terminology related to these fields. Now, while Arabic has had a significant influence on Spanish vocabulary, something we'll talk about in a moment, its influence on Spanish phonology, grammar, morphology, phrasing, and other aspects of the language was much more limited. Phonology. Spanish didn't incorporate any Arabic phonemes. Some authors conjecture that certain Spanish sounds may have become altered slightly by contact with Arabic, but this is debated. It's known that some words were altered over time because of pronunciation differences between Arabic and Castilian. For example, The unvoiced apico-alveolar fricative s of Castilian was often mispronounced by Arabic speakers as the unvoiced alveolo-palatal fricative sh. In some words, this sound later resolved to ch. So the Latin word saponis was at one time pronounced chabón in Old Spanish, and this word later became jabón. So it's known that the pronunciation of a small number of words was altered due to contact with Arabic, but this is not the same thing as Arabic altering the general pronunciation of Spanish. Expressions. By far the most common expression in Spanish originating with Arabic is the word ojalá. This word comes from this Arabic expression, meaning if God wills it, or if God wishes. A calque derived from this same source that's extremely common in modern Spanish is the phrase si Dios quiere. Similar phrases calqued from Arabic include que Dios guarde, que Dios mantenga, and Dios le ampare. Morphology. A Spanish morpheme borrowed from Arabic is the accented I at the end of a word denoting relationship or belonging. It's mostly used to refer to people from certain places. In modern Spanish, this suffix is mostly seen when discussing medieval history or with certain modern Middle Eastern or Northern African place names. Syntax. Some authors believe that the Spanish construction no, sino, which came from Latin, may have become more commonly used in Spanish because it mirrors an Arabic expression. VSO word order. The unmarked word order in Spanish is subject-verb-object, but Spanish word order is somewhat fluid, and other options are possible. Verb-subject-object word order, marked for emphasis or style, is much more common in Spanish than in other Romance languages, and some authors hypothesize that this is due to influence from Arabic, which often employs verb-subject-object word order. Arabic vocabulary. Castilian borrowed from Arabic around 4,000 words. Of course, a good percentage of those words are no longer current, having to do with ancient culture, technology, or practices. But several hundred are still found in the day-to-day vocabulary of Spanish speakers. A substantial percentage of Arabic loanwords in Spanish start with a or al. These sounds are derived from the Arabic article al, meaning the. So, for example, the Spanish word algodón comes from this Arabic expression, where this means the. It amuses me to think that when you express this word with its Spanish article, what you're saying is the cotton, where this is the Spanish word for the, and this is the Arabic word for the. Of course, it would be impossible for me to list here all the Spanish words of Arabic origin, or even the ones that have remained current. There are simply too many. But here's a short list of common everyday Arabic loanwords that you'll probably recognize. Arabic place names. Of course, there are many Spanish place names of Arabic origin. Here are some you may recognize. Arabic names. Names and surnames of Arabic origin are quite rare in Spain because of several periods in Spanish history in which the use of Arabic names was strongly discouraged. Two Spanish names of Arabic origin that have survived to the present are Fatima and Guadalupe. It seems these two have survived because they were place names of religious significance to Catholic Spaniards. Potentially interesting thought. One thing I find interesting to think about is how different the language of Spain would be today if it weren't for the Muslim invasion and occupation. Not only because of what the Muslims contributed to the Castilian language, but because without the historical events of Al-Andalus and the Reconquest, the Castilian language would have never existed. I'll get into this in more detail in my next video where I'll describe the rise of Castilian. Assuming an alternate history where the Visigothic kingdom survived and Spanish history evolved without significant outside influence, the dominant regional dialect of Romance on the peninsula would have been the dialect spoken in Toledo, the political, cultural, and religious center of the Visigothic kingdom. And that dialect would probably have grown in prominence and become the eventual language of the Spanish nation. Now, we don't know in any detail how Ibero-Latin was spoken in Toledo during the Visigothic period, and we'd only be guessing how that Romance language would have developed and evolved, or what it would sound like today. But we know one thing for sure. It wouldn't have been Castilian. It wouldn't have been the Spanish language as we know it. Alright, so in this video we discussed the fall of Rome, the Visigothic kingdom, the Islamic kingdom of Al-Andalus, and the Reconquest, and the effects that these historical events had on the evolution of the Spanish language. In my next video we'll continue our discussion, following the evolution of Latin into Spanish.